This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome to this joint session with Comparative Histories of Asia seminar and Rethinking Modern Europe. I think we've actually had a number of these joint sessions with Rethinking Modern Europe seminar group, and it's always been very exciting getting two different perspectives together. And as you may know, we were going to have another talk today with obviously Dr. Moore and his research co-author, Dr. Seth
Jacobowitz.
Yeah. But unfortunately, he has had this terrible health issue and he hasn't been able to come on the plane. So we've had to cancel it. And Dr. Moore very kindly stepped in, or remained, and offered another comparative topic, which I think would be really quite perfect as well. Now, Aaron is currently lecturing in East Asian history in the Department of History at the University of Manchester. And you must have won almost every single fellowship that I know, including for us, we would know Lieberhum Trust Research Fellowship, HRC grant he had together with Peter Cave, another Japan specialist at Manchester on education, childhood and youth in Imperial Japan. And he is currently the award holder of the Lieberhum Prize between 2015 to 2017. So you are on research leave, yeah, excellent. Now, he's got his first monograph out in 2013, and it's called Writing War, Soldiers Record the Japanese Empire, and came out of Harvard University Press. And then this year he has another monograph coming out, which is called Bombing the City, Civilians and the Air War in Britain and Japan, 1939 to 1945, this time from Cambridge University Press. And in addition, he's edited a volume with Rana Mitter on China in World War II. So today he's going to be talking about his forthcoming book, part of the forthcoming book. Yeah. Okay, so welcome, Aaron.
Thank you, Naoko, and thank you to the IHR organizers for giving me this opportunity to talk about the book. Although hopefully the book will be out at the end of this year, there is some time to make changes. So if you've got some critical feedback, I look forward to it, as it's my first foray really into British history, which is, as you know, a very large field indeed. So if I've missed something, or if you have some good readings to recommend, please do offer them. I'm going to start with a story of a diary that I was reading by a man named A.E. Randall, who was an auxiliary fire serviceman in Liverpool. He composed, I think, was one of the most detailed contemporary accounts of a German air raid available. From 1:45 p.m. to 1:45 a.m., 3rd to 4th May 1941, he kept minute-by-minute records of everything that he saw and felt. At first, he was paralyzed by the sight of planes, staring up with his mouth hanging open. He ran upstairs to warn his wife, writing in his logbook that the sky, quote, seemed full of throbbing planes now, with occasional rushing about or questing night fighters. Although he was a teetotaler, Randall drank rum from a flask and smoked through the night to steady his nerves. And then the attack started. There it is, a distant detonation of heavy bombs. On my left, too. The docks? I wonder. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 distinct explosions, and yes, a blinding flash. No mistaking that, that's a landmine. His mind then started racing through all the people that he was worrying about, his wife and his brother principally. It's this damn insistent, menacing, rhythmic drone of the Nazi bombers coming nearer and nearer, for all the world as if they're looking for me. That gets me. Rather unnerving, seems like an unbelievable time to reach you. Its engines throbbing out that, there's no other word for it. One for you, one for you, one for you. It can be heard above the loudest barrages, above the roar of huge fires as well. A blast from a mine then shattered all the windows in his neighborhood and he hit the floor. I got up off my knees and ran out unsteadily, he wrote in his diary, an awful fear gripping me, till I saw my own house still standing and the windows and frames all gone. Once this stuff starts falling down in your locality, it makes you jumpy, and once jumpy, you stay jumpy. In such conditions, the bombers seemed to be like unpredictable, angry, and capricious Greek gods. In wartime Nagoya, a teenage laborer named Kodama Yoshitaka moved through the dark city streets while the air raid sirens rang out, complaining bitterly about blackouts and poor city services. Thinking of all of his school friends who had graduated, been evacuated, or mobilized, Yoshitaka wrote how, quote, "my heart was wild with emotion." In such conditions, people like Yoshitaka turned to the sky and begged for guidance and deliverance. What will the new year bring in 1945? Death by air raids? Japan's victory? The end of the twisting path ahead was unclear. What sort of future am I facing? So many trials ahead of us. Oh God, please save us. Now, the bombing war was an attack on urban civilians that was arguably largely new in human history, producing some very strange effects. But the contours of this experience bore some striking similarities in both Britain and Japan. Briefly, just want to point out that through the course of my career as Naoko, as just mentioned, I've spent a lot of time in local archives in Japan, and I started to apply this methodology to Britain and found that there are a lot of local history centers across the country that collect things like diaries and memoirs and so on. And unfortunately, they don't get a lot of traffic. And what I started to realize is that there are a lot of similarities, particularly if one focuses one's attention on regional cities rather than capital cities or extraordinary situations like what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So these are, without going into too much detail, we can talk about it later, but that's the source base of the talk that I'm presenting today. And I noticed actually, I think Dietmar Suss's recent book, Death from the Skies, also employs a lot of these local history centers, and I think they could really be used a lot more extensively. In both countries, the arrival of violence on the home front was baffling. People were more accustomed to thinking of a war as a place where adult male soldiers were facing the threat of death in some far-flung no-man's land. Furthermore, for most of the modern era, I think, and maybe Naoko will disagree, but I doubt it, Britain and Japan were empires that largely exported state violence to their colonies. Indeed, both countries collaborated extensively in the past, including prosecuting mutually beneficial wars against the Qing dynasty, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, and other adversaries. As island nations, they are dependent on fragile links, particularly with maritime empires, for many inputs, including food, and were facing larger, more militarily powerful enemies who subjected them to brutal air campaigns in the Second World War. Contemporary observers, including H.G. Wells, considered Britain and Japan to be mirror reflections of East and West, committed to monarchy, class hierarchy, capitalist expansion, and civilization and enlightenment. For most of their modern history, Japan and Britain have been allies, or perhaps partners in crime. It may be unfair to compare their bombing experience when Japan suffered so much more than Britain. Some of you will probably be familiar with this historiography, but Japan's urban residences were mainly constructed with wood, whereas British ones were kind of more brick and mortar, making firebombing more effective against Japan. And firestorms killed more people than explosives. Second, the German Air Force failed to produce the kind of heavy, long-range bombers that could have wreaked havoc across Britain, especially in lightly defended regional cities. Wartime Royal Air Force aircraft production rivaled that of Germany, whereas Japan never had any chance of matching the United States Air Force's industrial might. The German Air Force dropped roughly 75,000 tons of explosives on Britain and launched 12,000 flying bomb and rocket attacks, mostly aimed at London. The U.S., a much more powerful country than Germany, dropped roughly 160,800 tons on Japan, excluding the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, all over the country, with much greater effect due to the nature of firebombing. Third, British defenses vis-a-vis the German Air Force were improving in 1940 all the time when compared to Japan's capabilities, which were declining in 1945, as the country was starved of steel, oil, and even food. Still, statistics distort and mask the social experience of war. The bombing of British cities was certainly a serious matter if you were in a city being bombed. Citizens were shocked and awed by the enemy attacks from the sky, particularly as the government failed to protect them. I.S. Haslewood, a London rescue driver, noted that her squad leaders sometimes broke down and began muttering that he would not go out into the inferno. Haslewood would write, "My hands were shaking so much I was fumbling wildly with the ignition key to the car while I could barely keep my foot on the accelerator." City people also struggled with the fact that the techniques and technologies of war had changed, turning cities into nightmarish landscapes, as one schoolboy described in Nagoya. "The bodies I saw in one neighborhood were not burned. The clothes had been blown off by the wind from bombs, but their skin had not been burned. I thought they looked like dolls. But in another neighborhood, the corpses were black. They didn't look like people, more like figures sculpted in ash. The internal organs, however, came bursting from inside the ash, raw and bloody." And I do apologize, this will be quite a graphic talk at times. The messages coming from the state and their allies in the mass media were mixed at best. directly resulting in a loss of faith among the citizens of both Britain and Japan. First, citizens knew about mass bombing campaigns from news reports from prior conflicts in Spain, China, and Poland. Second, government organized air raid patrols, firewatch brigades, and various pamphlets about bombing gave citizens some inkling of just how bad things are going to get. Third, urban citizens were able to connect news reports of the battles abroad with consequences back home. They're not stupid. They know what's coming. For the British, the 1939 non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Germany seemed to be the most ominous development because this was followed by calls for anti-aircraft reservists, right? They're getting a clue there. In the same way, many Japanese citizens suspected that bombings would intensify as Allied forces came closer to the home islands. Consequently, unsubstantiated rumors were running wild because the press wasn't really telling them much, including things like potential invasion, traitors behind the lines, and imminent bombings. Terrified people began to see spies everywhere, and local officials arguably enabled this panic. In Japan, information seemed to pass from defense forces through relatives into neighborhood associations, at which point word got out, "Fure ga tonarigumi kara gatta," and an enemy air raid was going to come, so there's this kind of chain of rumor going around. Racially and nationally charged beliefs about rape and war circulated vigorously in the rumor mill, with many convinced, like one Japanese girl's father, that should the nation lose the war, as he told her, the ones who will suffer the most will be women like you. There's some great stories, terrifying stories from a diary from a hairdresser in Coventry named Mary Bloom. And the women whose hair she would cut would tell her things like that they would be shipped to German baby farms to be mated with Germans, that they needed to start stockpiling grenades and poison for the coming occupation of Britain. No government could really hope to control this phenomenon, and Mary concluded fear and horror began to grip us in Coventry. The strange mood was exacerbated when citizens witnessed air skirmishes at the edges of the city, and this is when the invading and defending air forces are trying to achieve air superiority. Gladys Cox heard sirens from her top floor flat, and her diary entry captured how strange the calm was before the storm of the bombing war. A single white butterfly is fluttering down West End Lane, she wrote, alone in his glory. It is amusing to see and hear the lady shelter warden, now more important than ever, in rig-out of trousers, etc., plus a tin hat. She is blowing her whistle, hell for leather, adding terror to the scuttle for safety. To the east we see puffs of gray smoke hanging about the balloons, then 6 planes, presumably British, sprinting across the sky, right over us to the east. Mr. B.S., who seems to be sheltering in a first-floor flat opposite, waves cheerily up at us. In Japan, urban citizens were beginning to accept that the home islands were going to be directly attacked. As fighters arrived in Kure, one citizen wrote that it was a mad time, and it felt like things were going to a whole new level. Worse still, people in places like Coventry had to hear about or directly witness the bombing of nearby cities like Birmingham. Yoshitake Teruyoshi was working in Nagasaki when he heard of an air raid over his hometown, and he wrote, "Suddenly, the radio broadcast cut out with a pff sound, and he began and everyone started talking in his office, what's happened to Hakata? Because bombers initially attacked production centers, citizens saw factory workers rushed about the city covered in blood. Factory windows were being blown out, and semi-conscious men were literally blown out of the factories onto the streets. As Sugaya Sumi put it, people on the street looked at the medics carrying me covered in blood and thought, what the hell is going on? Staring in shock and terror. The tension was rising, particularly as the children were evacuated from the cities, which created an eerie silence in streets and alleyways where they used to play. I mean, keep in mind the fact that children were playing in the streets, right? And then suddenly they're all gone. So there's this kind of eerie quiet settling on the city. Mass observers recorded arguments erupting and fights breaking out in public spaces. Despite government assurances, urban citizens were prepared for the worst, with women often taking the lead. In Britain, women oversaw the construction of Anderson shelters, and others converted cellars into shelters, complete with bedding, china, books, food, and games. Kure housewife Ando Toyoko aggressively responded to government exhortations to prepare for the bombing. We all had to study to set and bind broken limbs, as well as gathering the neighborhood watch in the courtyard and running fire drills. Once we decided to dig out a shelter, it was the women who got down and dug out the granite-rich earth in the mountain with pickaxes. Still, many were unprepared, and during raids would scramble for only the most important items, their handbags with cash, ration books, ID cards, insurance policies, and gas masks. Families who had fled to the north in Japan were surprised to learn that they were now targeted by attacks. My auntie had heard that leaflets were dropped by Allied planes warning of the cities to be bombed, and they included Aomori and Hakodate, complained one teenager. So we had to prepare rucksacks for rapid flight, including enough rice one could carry, miso paste, salt, clothing, air raid caps, baskets instead of metal helmets, and one iron cooking pot. So they're literally just throwing things into bags and getting ready to run. The state could be worse than useless as well. When citizens in Aomori made preparations to evacuate family members and locate shelters, they were forced back into the city by officials who threatened to withhold rice rations if adults didn't return to work. When Allied bombers destroyed the city in one night, the roads leading south through the suburbs of Namidate and towards nearby rural towns such as Namikata were literally choked with panicked refugees. Despite months or even years of drilling and propaganda, the preparation proved almost worthless, particularly in regional cities like Coventry and Aomori. It didn't take long for the residents of Britain and Japan's cities, particularly regional cities, to realize that, despite many proclamations and assurances, they were largely defenseless. Now, initially, the bombing war was like a circus spectacle, or a holiday fireworks exhibition. First, the air raid sirens warned citizens to take cover, and the streets would empty. Next, raiders would come in to drive off or draw away defending planes already in the sky. Sometimes citizens recorded watching the dogfights. What was happening? Civilians in the city usually knew nothing. After scouting, small raids, and dogfights, other planes dropped flares to illuminate targets, which cast a strange, unsettling, beautiful, and almost carnivalesque glow over cities that were largely observing blackouts. And you have to keep in mind they're dark cities, right? And then the flares start coming down. Watching a major attack, Dorothy Hughes described a terrific fire over Liverpool. Flares dropping, red and green, all colors, just like day, a grand firework display. Shopkeeper's wife, Iketani Toyoko, referred to the visions of fire over the city as a beautiful hell. In London's East End, dockworker V. Reagan asked the bus driver to stop so that she could see the flares falling down near the Isle of Dogs. Her husband, Bill, held her hand tightly and wouldn't let her off the bus. She took a look at the flare burning out on the street and said, to no one in particular, "Doesn't it look beautiful? I would so like to have it." Flares made blacked-out cities under attack look briefly lovely, bringing to mind happy memories of festivals and parades. Kure housewife Itoi Soyoko described how the air assaults surprised civilians there. A loud, huge noise, and everything turned bright. It was a flare. When I looked out from the house, flares had illuminated the city streets from the shadows, and incendiary bombs were beginning to fall. All around the street it looked like lamps held up during a lantern parade, with little lights suddenly erupting into fires. Although it is hard to imagine today, the sights, sounds, and the general spectacle of the mass bombing were morbidly fascinating. The lights, colors, and sounds of the first stage of attack commanded the attention of the people, who obviously suspected it preceded a violent assault, but were momentarily seduced by its deceptive, festive technological glory. After the flares and initial bursts of incendiaries, the sights, sounds, and smells of the mass bombing of the city became more menacing, and fascination began to change to fear. When the attack on London began, Gladys Cox, a housewife in her 60s, was overwhelmed by the sensory experience. When the sirens wailed, almost immediately we heard the nearest and most intense gunfire yet. From the windows we saw, again to the east, large fires, and as we gazed, holding our breath, swift stabs of flame shot down from the sky in quick succession. Every stab sent up a vivid flash of flame, while already on a high wall of pure, lightning-colored fire glowed for miles along the eastern horizon. The rest of London was aflame with searchlights, bursting shells, floating flares, and the snaking radiance of Molotov bread baskets, which is another way to describe incendiaries. And the noise, booms, bangs, pops, crashes, screams, wardens' whistles, while below in the inky street the traffic crawled, dim-lit, ghost-like. Now, during the bombardment, fighter aircraft could suddenly appear in the skies, machine-gunning citizens in the roads, on streetcars, and trapped in trains. The screams of neighbors echoed through the streets, mixed with the din of panicked shouts from air raid patrolmen and fire wardens. Citizens in populous areas, including young people, emerged into the streets with fearful neighbors and consternated refugees. One teenager wrote in his diary, burning embers mixed with a powerful wind from the south came all around me, and there was a funnel-like cloud of black smoke. This is different than the fire of 10th March. This time, when we got to a neighborhood Shinto shrine, there was a huge fire. There were old people with children on pushcarts, and the desperate faces of the mothers who screamed at them while on the road were terrifying. In diaries, memoirs, and even paintings of enemy bombers over the cities of Britain and Japan, the residents marveled and screamed at the planes, lights, and fires as the systematic destruction of the city began in earnest. Takashi Yoshiji recalled seeing the flares illuminating the sky brighter than day, so bright, he said, that you could see a pin dropping in the night. And then suddenly someone called out in a loud voice in the shelter, "We're going to die tonight." When the bombs hit, he wrote, "This was the first time I noticed how beautiful the incendiaries were, so much so that it almost overcame the horror as they showered down like rain on Chiba. I can never forget this scene. The fires and explosions combined spectacle and terror like nothing they'd seen before, and the annihilation of the city was so far beyond the ordinary citizen's comprehension, he could only watch, flee, and watch again." Then, of course, the terrible effects of modern warfare hit the people en masse. The fires were so intense that they literally burned on bricks and concrete, overwhelming people trapped in shelters and buildings. Red-hot shrapnel from anti-aircraft guns and bomb casings fell from the sky like scorching razor rain, searing through roofing and setting fire to buildings. High explosive bomb blasts sucked the breath right out of people's bodies in dance halls, leaving them dead by suffocation. Those who worked in power stations like J.W. Dorrington were right in the middle of the bombers' sights. Like others who experienced these attacks firsthand, he emphasized the sounds of the bombing attacks while fighting to save Bristol. The bombing had ceased, he wrote, and the only sounds to be heard were the throbbing of fire pumps, the crash of falling buildings, and the roar of many fires still blazing. A quiet hour or so passed, but the lull ended at 1 a.m. when the Raiders' overhead buzzer in the station sounded again, and the muck started to fall. 15-year-old Okamura Toshiyasu narrowly missed a direct hit from a bomb that split a modern concrete bridge right in half. He ran with his mother into the fields nearby their home in Shizuoka, where they hoped to survive the growing conflagration in the city. But before long, he wrote, we were assaulted by burning embers in the air. I couldn't bear to open my eyes, and it was painful to even breathe. It was like being caught in a fierce blizzard of flame. In the middle of running, my father fell to the ground, and my elder brother screamed at him, "What the hell are you doing? Get up!" I was the only one who went in the shelter. It was clear in the morning, and it was like everything had been wiped clean. Here and there were scorched remains of buildings standing forlornly, and the blackened trees occasionally popped out. Although I thought my father had fallen down during this blizzard of fire, in fact, he'd been blasted by a bomb. He'd been hit so hard his ears were packed with dirt. While the enemy robbed the city of life, which included the inhabitants, it also took away its structure, its transport, its various transport conduits, its energy supply, its food supplies, its familiar landmarks. People couldn't even recognize their hometowns anymore. As the city died, the people died with it, and they saw iconic buildings falling. For many, it felt as if they were losing a piece of themselves. Smells were vividly recorded as well. Working for an office in Chiba's main rail network, Watanabe Masanori fled the city in panic and with all of his colleagues running in all directions as they were trapped inside an Allied bomber firestorm. Thoroughly in a panic, Masanori jumped into a river and sank up to his chest. As hot embers and dust whirled around him, he found his way into an open sewer and managed to escape. Only after cleaning the stinking sewage off of his body, Masanori wrote in his memo book, "Only a person who experienced it knows this pain." The destroyed cities then became unhygienic mausoleums, filled with the stench of rotting human bodies. After watching Aomori being totally destroyed in one day, Narita Kazuko remembered the horrible smell of corpses that came from the city and down to Nagoya town, about 15 miles away. And she said, "I can still feel disgust about it to this day." Perhaps because Coventry was destroyed so quickly as well, memories of rotting bodies were powerful. One survivor recalled that the entire city smelled of corridor lime. It was evidently some form of disinfectant, he wrote, because of the death and the rats. The accounts of ordinary people are rich with such language, capturing the sights, sounds, and smells. Now, excitement and panic inevitably gave way to terror, and terror to rage and despair. At first, in Birmingham, people wandered in the streets asking confusedly, "What should we do? Where should we go? Will it be safe in a cellar? Oh, this wretched war." Despite the best efforts of authorities, the chaos that followed a serious attack on the city could not be stopped. Fujimoto Kinoko, a 35-year-old high school teacher, watched the destruction of Hachioji from her front door. She worried over the safety of her parents, saw the fires consume her hometown, and recorded casualties from seemingly arbitrary machine gun attacks by fighter aircraft on civilians. On a particularly bad raid, she wrote in her diary, "Fires inside and outside the city rise up and fill the sky. The sun was choked by smoke, and ashes rain down from the clouds. It is the work of the despicable Americans." Other Japanese victims of firebombing wrote of their hatred for the Allied bombers, saying that their bodies were shaking with rage. Bombers gave no quarter to combatants and non-combatants, and the feelings of helplessness were met with rage. Arguably, the most horrifying experience of being bombed was coming face to face with the bodies. Some cities were relentlessly bombed through the war, leaving citizens exposed to the dead again and again and again. For London, a rescue driver, I.S. Haslewood, and Mochizuki Masako, a 36-year-old housewife in Tokyo, the experience left a deep impression. Haslewood's squad responded to a call in Beaufort Street, where an air raid shelter was apparently destroyed near a burning block of flats. Her subsequent diary entry reveals the horror. The scene was of death and devastation. Huge slabs of concrete trapped poor mangled bodies beneath their jagged weight. Poor twisted bodies, blackened and begrimed from the blast and dust. Bits of bodies lay in puddles of water, blood, and filth. Dear God, the first example of Hitler's work. I felt my stomach heave for a paralyzing second, and I thought I was going to vomit, thereby disgracing myself and my squad forever. But I managed to gulp heavily and then felt more or less all right. There was a little I could do after we had searched the neighboring flats for possible oases of shock, but stand and hand down blankets to the rescue men in that terrible pit for them to wrap around the bodies as they disintegrated them from the debris. As much as Tokyo resident Mochizuki Masako would have preferred to avoid such sights herself, they were as inseparable in Japan's capital as they were in Britain's. The massive firebombing of Honjo Ward by the Allies forced her, shaking with fear, through a sea of fire that was consuming northeast Tokyo. She was looking for her in-laws, and when she arrived at her in-laws' place in Tokyo, she found nothing but ruins. Even the chickens in the back garden were reduced to bones and ashes. I had no strength to move, she wrote, and simply sat on the scorched remains of a toppled tree. Spurred on by her nephew, Masako wrenched herself away from the scene in order to search for the missing relatives, but she found that, quote, everywhere the city was full of dead bodies. Corpses that were burned black were indistinguishable from each other, and even after a day's search, we couldn't find a single one of the missing members of our family. We, of course, found other people, but they didn't know our relatives, and we didn't know theirs. At this point, the army arrived and started loading the dead onto trucks. They were pulling corpses out of the river using a hook and a pole. As if giving voice to her concerns, her nephew said, "If we don't get out of the city, we'll end up like this." In London, returning to the area blasted by a high-explosive bomb, Haslewood and her crew pulled up a slab of concrete to discover the body of an old man still sitting in his chair. He was not outwardly very much damaged, she wrote, except for a small scalp wound and half a hand missing. He was just sitting there, peacefully. So surely his death must have been instantaneous. I do hope so. Rescuers were so respectful and gentle in handling of the ghastly bodies, so careful not to cover up the indecencies of the horrors with blankets as soon as possible. Haslewood's team bagged bodies and cleaned debris, as well as climbing down into waterlogged basements in order to calm, quote, hysterical women and cantankerous old men. All the while, Haslewood and the men she worked with choked back their own emotions and sick, as the city consumed, ground, and spat up more bodies of its former residents. We could hardly have had a worse baptism into this job, she wrote despondently. Up until this morning, I'd never even seen a dead body. It could be worse, as Masako discovered, when the bodies became familiar. She wrote in her diary, "The army was piling bodies on top of one another, one by one, in the bed of a truck. And I looked at each corpse's face as I walked by, and at the very bottom, there was my sister and my niece. My sister had kneeled down and put her left hand around Noriko's face, the niece, which was turned up to the sky, and had wrapped her right hand around the girl's back, leaving the two locked in an embrace. For some reason, their hair was not burned. Their hairstyles, gold fillings, and kimono inside their thighs were all fine. The flesh inside their thighs was still pink. We could only hold each other and say, 'Why? Why did this happen to them?' and then fall silent, crying, unable to leave them. The city's dead choked the rivers, the roads, the canals, and the alleyways, and the armed forces were frequently deployed to dispose of them. Mass graves littered the cityscape, and citizens were forced to see the bodies of neighbors, friends, and relatives tossed onto trucks and into pits as if they were pieces of rubbish. In such terrifying situations, strong emotions produced some strange behavior. For example, some people responded with humor. In Coventry, Gladys Hollingsworth noted how some people tried to pass off their losses with jokes. Shops that had windows blown in put up signs saying, "More open than usual." A ladies' dress shop whose windows were smashed had the sign up, "Smashing Bargains." During the 1940 Christmas blitz over Liverpool, Dorothy wrote in her diary, "All still running. Buses, trains, hoses, Italians." In Bristol, W.A. Hares described how a pub landlord is ready to joke and tells customers that drinks are on the house as he doesn't think there will be one tomorrow. Still, humor and anger were never really very far apart. When an American B-29 crashed in Shizuoka, famously, the surviving pilots emerged to face an enraged mob of Japanese civilians. The mob stabbed them to death, including women and children, crushing their heads with stones, openly crying. When the state and social order collapsed, and emotions were allowed to rule decisions, this kind of extreme behavior was probably inevitable. In both Britain and Japan, the vast majority of national resources were committed to defending the capital cities, London and Tokyo, where the political, financial, and industrial elite lived. Panic seized citizens in regional cities, causing spontaneous mass exoduses from Bristol, Osaka, Coventry, Shizuoka, Manchester, and Nagoya, with many caught off guard, taking shelter in ditches, behind walls, and even in drain pipes. The size of a city could mask or enhance the severity of an enemy campaign in the eyes of those who endured it. After a terrible bombing of Coventry, residents complained of hating the city, comparing it to a graveyard. Citizens in Hull similarly said that coming back to the city was one of the worst things they could imagine. While large, sprawling metropolises with good transport allowed many more areas for fleeing residents to take refuge, smaller cities were arguably worse off. Heading west on the train to Hachioji, one 19-year-old student named Yagi Junichi kept a diary describing the annihilation of the smaller cities west of Tokyo. Meeting relatives in the remnants of their houses along the way, he grew more and more despondent until he had to leap out of the train and run for the hills. He wrote in his diary, "I thought about our family's bad fortune, and my heart was wild with anger. Going home, there was no home. I have no home." Although London was hit with more bombs, a city like Hull, which was smaller with fewer amenities and amusements, took more damage as a percentage of city space, in part because the German Air Force planes sometimes dumped remaining bombs there on their way back from other targets. In her diary, scribbling with a pencil into a tiny notepad, Dora Mockett tried to capture the relentless and inescapable misery of being trapped in Hull. Just after 9 p.m., they started coming over in waves again. The noise was awful, and they sounded so low we could hear the propellers. They sounded, too, as though they were doing some machine gunning of the citizens. Then the anti-aircraft started, and the noise was so great we could not tell whether any bombs were even being dropped. We sat in the shelter for nearly an hour with our coats on. It was so cold, and our earplugs stuck in our ears. Heavily pregnant, she was starving from lack of food, and had no access to a midwife as the city hospital had been destroyed by bombers. Recounting all of the casualties coming in and around her on the street, Dora described the shaking of her house and the swish of the bombs falling, simply writing, "I simply feel very weary tonight." By 1944, the major air raids in Hull had finished annihilating the majority of the buildings there. And Edith Pierce wrote in her diary, "I was miserable thinking about going back to Hull and dreading it more than anything else in my life." The national media blackout of the raids on regional cities didn't help, because while they were being bombed, they were reading about the heroism in London. Government officials only vaguely referred to northeastern towns and northwestern towns in the press, but it hardly masked the severity of these attacks and often demoralized or enraged residents in these cities. Citizens of the city were sometimes perplexed by their own inarticulate emotional responses to being bombed. When the Isle of Dogs was leveled by German air forces, Bill Reagan and his squad of emergency workers found the bodies of 2 teenage girls who had been buried alive. The dust of vaporized buildings had packed them in airtight, preserving their corpses almost perfectly. Bill observed that they both had only their knickers and short petticoats on. Their limbs were not even rigid. Strangely, this disturbed the rescuemen more than the pieces of bodies and mangled torsos that they normally bagged up. Some men vomited, and others stood paralyzed by the sight of the dead, eerie, barely clad teenage girls. They were lifelike, he wrote. I could not let them be handled like the usual corpses. I know I would have belted the first one who handled them with disrespect, but nobody makes a move to shift them, and are just standing there, gawking. I look up at George, and I said, stretcher, blanket. Then I put my right arm around her shoulders, with her head resting against mine, and a left arm under her knees, and so carried her up. I laid her on the stretcher. You'll be comfortable now, my dear. I did exactly the same with the other one. I stood up and waited for some smart aleck to make a snide remark, but nobody did. I cooled down a bit, and I smoked a cigarette. Why was I so angry? He had picked up the severed feet of his dead friends on previous trips, but seeing the bodies of these two girls and holding their kind of soft bodies had really traumatized him. Now, there's a clue to why he's reacting this way, because later he talks about how he was separated from his two daughters. He has two little girls himself, who were evacuated to rural Oxfordshire, and the sight of the dead girls stirred up powerful, inchoate, and half-articulate emotions inside him. He received letters from his girls off and on, telling him about their lives at school, such as this one from little B. I hope you're all right, Daddy. Our cold is better, and we have started school today, and we have some nice sums, and I had them all right today. One of the soldiers fell down in the mud, dirted his trousers up, and he had just changed them. One of the soldiers are just like Uncle Tom. They said they was going to put the searchlight on tonight. We went on to Gypsy Friday with Auntie and bought some cough sweets. Well, lots of love, V. Bill read these letters in quiet moments and then recorded his thoughts in his diary, reread the children's little letters, and made myself thoroughly miserable and almost wished for nightfall. At least during the bombing, your thoughts are concentrated on the job that you're doing. Ordinary people were terrified, chased, watched their neighbors murdered and their homes burned, missed their loved ones desperately. But to what end? They felt powerless. Fear and loathing are understandable, but neither accelerated the end of the war, nor did they afford these people any relief. So I would say that the adherence to faith in the face of such overwhelming violence seems, in the final analysis, to be a reaction best considered alongside the anger, the fear, and the panic that people were feeling during the destruction of the city. Following the combination of attacks from the sky and ineffective domestic defense, many turned to the supernatural, with view that the gods, Buddhas, and other forces might intervene and change the cruel fate that the enemy had visited on them. During the devastating air raids over Bristol, one woman recorded in her diary the horrors and losses of the conflict, including her church, St. Michael's. God grant it is going to be all right for us, she would write. Above all, I must keep my faith in God, whatever happens. Meanwhile, St. Michael's was leveled by air raids, and her father came down in the cellar with handfuls of tiles and earth blasted away from the sacred site. Meanwhile, being attacked or spared was evidence for some of heaven's intent. Middle school student Kobayashi Narimitsu wrote in his diary that, following an air raid on Shizuoka that destroyed the school, the class was berated by their teacher. You school children, your will has become weak, so we have been scolded by the gods. Take this as an opportunity to pull yourselves together. Others found the use of religion to interpret the war intolerable. Pushing through a selection from the Catholic book club, Olive Metcalf had to put down Jean Duplessis' Human Caravan after suffering 80 pages because, she said, fundamentally, I do not incline to the self-glorified, intolerant Catholic conception of the world. These are her words, okay, not mine. For Duplessis, the individuals meant nothing, and human feelings were at a premium. Perhaps I would have forgiven his style if I had not found out he believed in the fall of the angels, Adam and Eve in a golden age, and Noah's flood destroying all the world. I think at a time when food, money, and safe lodgings in a place like Hull were in such short supply, this sort of metaphysical rumination on the church's role in a conflict over the future of mankind must have been very tiring to Olive. Since supernatural beings gave no indication of their will, urban residents used faith to embrace war and reject it, challenge authority, or deploy God's authority in order to get what they wanted from others. Prayer emerged most powerfully as a desire to call down supernatural powers to protect or simply communicate with family members during air raids. Kane Nakakimi was a 31-year-old woman who lived in a town called Ohisa. Her younger sister and brother-in-law, however, lived in Honjo Ward, which was in the middle of Tokyo being bombed, in particular the terrible 9th March 1945 bomb, which destroyed much of the city. On the 10th of March, she hurried with many others to look for relatives in the city, arriving at Ueno Park. But the city center in nearby Asakusa was completely hidden by smoke and airborne debris. She saw the corpses of the elderly who had lost their will to carry on and were burned alive on the streets. She immediately began praying, "Please, Hirasaku, please, Fumiko, please be all right." I prayed. I was rushing along. It was as if my heart was flying up to the heavens. There, Kimi encountered badly burned refugees who were crying and calling out in loud voices, looking for their relatives. Their faces were black and their eyes were red from exposure to smoke. Soon she was crying as well, calling out, "Hirasaku, Fumiko," but there was no reply. As ambulance services and soldiers rushed around the ruined city, she prayed. She read omens and signs all around her, and her heart, quote, was pierced by a premonition of ill fortune. The next day, she learned from her sister's neighborhood association that, of the 58 members, all but 5 had met the sad fate of being wiped out. She and her mother found a teacup belonging to the young couple they were looking for, and burned it as an offering to the dead in a religious ritual. "O trail of smoke spiraling here and there into the sky," she wrote in her diary, "won't you please pacify the spirits of the dead here?" There were tears on my face. Meeting with Hirasaku's elder sister, we spoke of him and Fumiko and wept. I took off my air raid protective clothing and my white apron, going to bed. How many months has it been in this war? Because of the impersonal nature of the mass bombings, which rained down death from the heavens like spite from a wrathful god, civilians such as Kimi turned to prayer, both overtly religious and personally spiritual, to make a symbolic defense against the ruthlessness of the attack. Indeed, from the perspective of civilians, scientific advancement had created a terrifying new form of warfare, which seemed to trigger a return to faith, if not religion. Conversely, the drop in church attendance did not always reflect an acceptance of atheism or materialism or any such thing in Britain and Japan. Watanabe Teruko recalled her mother finding a small Buddhist statue during an air raid, stuffing it into Teruko's pocket, and just praying that it would protect her like some kind of charm or fetish. In Britain, civilians in wartime wavered between astrology, superstitious acts like throwing salt over your shoulder, and pleading to supernatural beings, as each of these methods in turn failed to grant them control over their destiny. People called out to different gods to save them, and they did so with different languages, dialects, and regional accents. In the northwest city of Akita, one Japanese man recalled fleeing with his family, diving down, throwing futons over them, and praying. Shigemitsu, our 3-year-old, cried for 3 hours straight as the planes attacked. 3 hours straight. And then the planes came humming over us, and all we could do was pray. Nanmaida, nanmaida, nanmaida. And then you'd hear the sounds fade away, and you took the futon off to look. But then they'd come again, and down you'd go. It seemed like you never caught a break. It was just like, what's that? What's coming? Nanmaida, nanmaida, nanmaida. Meanwhile, in Himeji, Kobayashi Takako, thinking this is the end of the world, described Kansai speakers desperately shouting, Nanmanda butsu, nanmanda butsu. And those speaking standard Japanese in Tokyo were crying, Namu Amida Butsu, Namu Amida Butsu. All were dialectical versions of the same prayer. In the name of the Amida Buddha, I pray. If the words of prayer were magic and invoked the power of the gods, then the dialect and the pronunciation might be important. Or perhaps they had the wrong language and the wrong god altogether. Outside of Swansea, during the firebombing of the town, Laurie Latchford recalled a Welsh villager running through the city shouting, "Oh my God, oh God, oh my God." After the May Blitz in Liverpool, H.B. Monk noted that everyone is appalled by the devastation here. If the Germans are able to drop heavier bombs as we have been able to do to them, will God please help us? Monk called on God to save the British people from the punishment inflicted by the Germans, but was his accent correct, or was it the Welsh girls? Was it Kansai dialect or Akita dialect of Japanese? Was it the Christian God and not the Japanese Shinto deities who would listen to the Germans? Or would they listen to the British? If it was the British, which denomination had best access? Despite these thorny theological questions, ordinary people nevertheless saw in religion and ritual practice a means to save themselves. In their eyes, prayer was a suitable answer to the seemingly distant modern technological terror that the enemy was inflicting on them. For both good and ill, prayer was a powerful tool to mobilize ordinary people into action, especially if they are part of a tightly knit religious community in which ritualized behavior and speech was part of daily life. Many priests and pastors performed valuable service for those who found themselves abandoned during the war. Although not all of them were helpful, One Unitarian minister recalled refusing a minister from another faith who demanded to perform services in his church, but when he asked him if he would help scrub and tidy the shelter, the parson beat a hasty retreat. Furthermore, the unbreakable bonds within specific religious communities, strengthened by faith, could put individuals in greater danger. In Shizuoka, Mizutani Teruko explained her paternal grandfather's difficult situation. In addition to being infirm due to age, rheumatism was hurting his joints, so he loathed to go out into the air raid shelter. Friends and relatives asked him to evacuate to the countryside, but he resolutely refused. Upon further reflection, Teruko observed that it was her grandfather's faith that anchored him to Shizuoka's perilous city center, because he didn't want to go away from the temple that he helped build with his friends. When Teruko returned, she found that her family was all but wiped out in Shizuoka. Her mother, her father, and her brother's blackened bodies were all inside the rubble of their home. Despite being a highly devout family, prayer had not saved them. Finally, she found her grandfather, who refused to abandon his temple. His clothes had all been burned away, she wrote, and in one place the flesh had burned right down to the bone. But he had sat there with his hands clasped in prayer and his meditation position unbroken. What a remarkable act of prayer, she thought. What an incredible way to leave this world. It moves me to this day when I think about it. He was able to move, but he did not even attempt to run and just sat there meditating, motionless. He resolved to watch the temple that he had rebuilt for 30 years burn while he drew his last breath. Years after the war, when she was older, she wrote, "I understand why he felt this way. But at the time, as a teenager, she recalled thinking, why don't you think more about your family?" Of course, because young people were expected to show deference to their elders, she didn't say this at the time. If she had, perhaps her grandfather would have survived into the peaceful post-war years, which Teruko herself was able to enjoy. If the gods were listening, they gave no evidence of it, and so for some skeptics of the wartime generation, this seemed to be a damning indictment of man's reliance on faith. The losses and humiliations that people like Endo Naoi had to endure during the bombing of Shizuoka inspired her to write, "It was terrible. I despise the injustice of the gods." Others rejected divine punishment as an empty threat, like Joan Rice when she wrote that hell was, quote, "such a dumb idea," because she didn't believe in religion's mumbo-jumbo of mystical heaven and life hereafter. In any case, religious ritual and discourse was an indisputable part of the city people's narratives. "The air raid sirens carried on calling," wrote one university student about the bombing of Fukuoka. "It was a sound that called people into the ground. There was no mistake. This was the voice from hell." The home front was replete with people who had lost their faith, sometimes as a direct consequence of the war. Endo Naoi put it well. "My maternal uncle, who used to take me to the movies a lot, disappeared beneath the waves during the war while he was in the Navy, and his elder brother was permanently crippled by the wartime injuries. My sister and I waited ever so patiently, but my brother-in-law never came home from his service overseas. My niece will never know her daddy's face. More than any other, I think, my niece is the victim of an unfortunate war. I completely stopped praying to any gods. There's never been any word as to how my loved ones died in the war. If the gods were absent, it sometimes seemed that the devils were in ample supply. Urban citizens drew on a rich literature describing preternatural fires, demonic presences, and hellish landscapes to describe their experience of the city under attack. While Japan and Britain had some important differences during World War II, they both experienced widespread social mobilization, air attacks by more powerful neighbors, rationing, and the consequences of the collapse of their pre-war empires, as well as the enduring importance of faith. The citizens of Britain and Japan flocked to the cities because they were sources of man-made light, power, wealth, and amusement, but the bombing war transformed them into figuratively demonic presences, characterized by fire, hunger, and death. In Liverpool, H.B. Monk reflected in his war diary on how modernization, which created the major cities of Britain and Japan and their empires, had actually made life worse. "We pay a big price for our industrialization," he wrote. "It may mean a big empire, but whether it makes for real happiness for people like me, I am doubtful."